Welcome to This Podcast Is Making Me Thirsty, the number one destination for Seinfeld fans. This episode 130. We're very excited for today's guest. He's a writer, producer, and comedian. He's an acclaimed TV and film executive who has led several production companies, including the Howard Stern Production Company, SONY BMG Music Entertainment, the FS Network, Viacom, and MTV Networks. He co-created the Best Damn Sports Show, period. He's written for Son of the Beach and Living Color and Saturday Night Live and was a production assistant for The Late Show with David Letterman. And of course, he was a key executive at NBC responsible for Seinfeld development and one of the key network champions who ultimately greenlit the show. Please welcome Jeremiah Bosgang. Jeremiah, thanks for joining.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
How about that intro, Jeremiah?
I know, it's all downhill. It's all downhill from here. People are going to be, what the how is it possible?
So a ton to get to, but take us back. July 5th, 1989, the Seinfeld Chronicles airs. I mean, just how'd you get the role? Like, how'd you get connected with Rick Ludwin? Just kind of take us a little before 89 on how that whole situation came about.
Sure. Rick Ludwin, who, of blessed memories, just was really my first mentor and really gave me this huge break. What happened was I had moved to LA, this wannabe writer, performer. I had been living in New York for several years prior, studying acting and taking acting classes and working in some comedy clubs, second tier comedy clubs. And I went out to LA just to kind of see. I had friends who had made the journey out there from New York before me and who had successfully landed jobs writing for television, and they were making really good money and they had health benefits and everything. So I thought, I'm going to try it too. And I rode my motorcycle out to LA, and I was just doing odd jobs that, the kind of stuff that wannabe actor writers do. Short of waiting tables, I did that, but I was also installing high-end audiovisual systems in people's homes. Back then, a high-end system were these huge projection TVs. You guys might be too young to remember, but they were like these, like the size of three huge bookcases. Right. So, and they would have like a rear projection. Anyway, I would install those and put in sound systems because I was kind of nerdy and I did stuff like that. And, who are the people in LA who are getting these high-end systems? A lot of them work in the entertainment business. And one of them was this really, really good guy who became a good friend of mine. His name was Larry Little, and he was a senior executive at Warner Brothers. And he kind of took a liking to me, and he'd invite me to parties at his house, and I'd be meeting all these different like executives and agents and stuff, and I met a guy at this party, a friend of Larry's, who became a very influential person in my life, a writer named Jim Stein, really funny writer who you mentioned Son of the Beach. Jim was one of the three guys who co-created Son of the Beach with Tim Stack and Dave Morgeson. That would be years later. But at this point, I just met Jim, and I thought, and he was an executive producer, a showrunner. And so I begged him if he would look at one of my spec scripts. I think I had It's the Gary Shandling Show spec script. And so he took it, and like a week later or something, I get a phone call from Jim, and he's like, "Hey, I read your script." And like, as you guys know, the vast majority of people who offer to read things or do things, you never hear from them again. But Jim really did read it. He goes, "Yeah, I thought your script was pretty good." And he said, "Have you ever thought about becoming an executive?" And I was like, is that like kind of a left-handed compliment? What is it? Was my writing that bad that, the best? But no. And the reason he asked was he was really close friends with Rick Ludwin. And he said, there's this executive at NBC who works at the time, as you said, Chris, this is late 80s. It was before the real advent of reality television, when any of those shows that were really the forerunners to reality shows, things like Unsolved Mysteries on NBC, that it involved some reenactments and some writing. Things like that were really the earliest stages before really even The Real World was a hit on MTV. Anyway, that was primarily Rick's area at NBC, where these, and it plays directly into Seinfeld and the development of Seinfeld. But he was involved in doing specials, variety shows. He did all of the Bob Hope specials. He did, what was the precursor to alternative programming. Anyway, Jim thought that Rick might like me, and so he introduced us. And that's how I got to meet Rick Ludwin. I don't know if I'm rambling on too much. You guys have to cut me off if I'm boring you with stuff, but it was funny. I'll tell you just like a really quick story. So I was like this actor wannabe, right? And all of a sudden I have this interview with an NBC executive. I wasn't even really sure what an NBC executive did, other than, they were like, powerful guys or something. And so I didn't know what I was going to wear to them. I didn't have a suit or even a tie. So I borrowed a sport coat from my friend, my roommate, that didn't even fit me. He was like 30 pounds heavier than me. So it looked like my dad's sport coat. And I went to a department store in LA. And this is a little tip for viewers, if they're ever in this situation. I bought a necktie, but I didn't cut the price tag off. I just tied the tie and I tucked the price tag in like between my buttons. So then after the interview, take the tie back, full refund.
Nice.
Been there, done that, Jeremiah.
Have you literally done that same thing? Oh, that's so funny.
That's
so,
great.
I mean, that was like the interview with Rick Ludwin. I'm wearing this tie with a price tag and my roommate's sport coat, but he was such a really great, unpretentious, down-to-earth guy. And he liked some of my background. Like you mentioned, I had been a student intern. Actually, Tony, not to correct you, but it wasn't Late Show with David Letterman. That was the CBS version. I was on Late Night with David Letterman, which was the first NBC incarnation of that show, of that franchise. And so, Rick liked that I worked in Late Night. That was also his area. He was, and at the time, NBC was the only network that really had a late night schedule. They had the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Then they had they had a show that followed Carson, which was Late Night with David Letterman. And then they had Saturday Night Live on Saturday night. So they really had a schedule. The other networks at the time, now, of course, they're all in the late night game. But at the time, they didn't really have it. So Rick was very unique in that position. And he liked that I had done an internship at Late Night with David Letterman. And he liked that when I was in college, I toured with Second City. And so he thought, oh, this guy's like a quirky choice. I think that's what he was thinking. And that's why how I met him. And I think why he gave me the opportunity.
Oh man, that's incredible. So when did, they recreate the show within the show in season 4 of Seinfeld, right? Where your character, we'll get to it later. We know that you actually auditioned for it, but you and Rick are basically, going up to Jerry and saying, here's our card, right? How did it actually happen? Like when was Seinfeld like finally presented to you and Rick, where it was like, we have this show, we're going to do a show, or how did that kind of those first conversations kind of start?
So really, when I talk about Rick or me, I just want to be really, really clear. It was all Rick. Rick Ludwin is the executive of any executive, whether it was an executive at NBC or an executive at the studio, which was Castle Rock. And there were some very talented, influential executives who were really supportive of the show and really helped it. But Rick Ludwin is in a separate category. So I just don't want to be disingenuous by saying, oh, well, Rick and I were, it wasn't like that. I was his, water boy, and he really was the guy, really the guy behind it. But in any event, the earliest moves with that in the development world for what would become Seinfeld happened before I was even at NBC, a year before. So one of the things that at the time network executives would do, there'd be this annual retreat where all the development executives, whether they worked in comedy development, drama development, movies and miniseries, which were a big program category back then, not as much now. And then Rick's area of alternative programming would go on this retreat, and people would talk about, and pitch to the head of all programming. It might be at NBC. Ultimately, at the time, it was Brandon Tartikoff, but Warren Littlefield, of course, was very senior there, as was another development executive, Perry Simon. And people would pitch their ideas. Well, I think we should do, a comedy set in, a garage, a taxi garage, or, something. And it was Rick Ludwin who stood at that meeting, and he said, look, there's this young comedian who's been on Carson a number of times. I've been tracking him. He's did an HBO at the time, the HBO Young Comedian Special. That was a huge franchise and a real watermark for a comedian. And Jerry had done that. And he held up some clippings or whatever. I wasn't at the meeting, but I've heard it from many sources. And he said, this guy, Jerry Seinfeld, this guy is really interesting and we should be doing something. And you have to understand a little bit of the dynamic, the politics of network development at the time. Rick's area, as much as I love Rick and respect him, but that area at the time, specials, variety, and late night programming, it was really the stepchild area to the meat and potatoes, the real prestige areas of programming development back in those late 80s and 90s were comedy and drama. Those were where the real hits would come from. And again, this was before, reality shows and, Biggest Loser, Survivor, etc. The playfield has changed drastically since then. But so there was a little bit of dismissiveness towards Rick and me and our area that guys, you do the Bob Hope specials, or you guys stick with, super bloopers and practical jokes. Don't step into these other areas.
But Jeremiah, I don't mean to cut you off there, but that's a good point. So dramas and comedy. So, the LA Laws and Cosby Show, et cetera. Did Rick greenlight any other sitcoms through this late night, or Seinfeld was the first?
No. And Seinfeld, when Rick first pitched, and wanted to develop it, the comedy development people, everybody has their own taste and judgment, and they had hit shows and really smart things that they did. They developed, the comedy development people at that time developed Friends, which became, a mega gargantuan hit. So, people have different sensibilities, but Rick was like, screw it. I'm going to take some of my monies, my development funds that I have in specials, and you guys probably know this story because you're so, the Seinfeld history so well. And I'm going to create 4 half-hour specials / episodes of this show using my money. And I'm going to do it. And at the time, the truth is, and you guys will remember this if you remember those early episodes of Seinfeld, it was a hybrid show. What Seinfeld was in the early days, it was a combination of Jerry's stand-up comedy. There'd be these initially 3 pods of stand-up at the beginning, middle, and end of the show. And the idea was that there would be this world created behind him of his friends and his world. So you'd see where he got his ideas for his stand-up. So if he was doing some stand-up about, how much do you tip a guy who delivers your blah-de-blah, and he would do his stand-up. And then you fade into some vignettes and scenes with these, what were supposed to be supporting characters to show basically in his fictitious life, how Jerry came up with those ideas. So it wasn't a conventional half-hour scripted show in that sense. It evolved in success. Those characters, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Michael Richards, and Jason Alexander, they became so popular, and the dynamic that Jerry had with them and the stories that Larry David would oversee were such a unique voice and so interesting that the pods of stand-up sort of fell away. It moved from having 3 to 2 to none. And they just felt like, no, we're just going to now tell stories using these characters. So that's a little bit of how in the early days, the show evolved. I don't know, Chris, if I answered your question.
Yeah,
I think I just sort of rambled off.
That was great. And to your point, like just to kind of back up, I mean, you kind of took that the stand up going away, right? Like you mentioned, or kind of the show evolving, right? But at the early part, right, that first 4 episodes when the stand up was still there and the characters were still developing, we'll call it season 1, right? For the 4 episodes after the pilot. How much of that was Ludwin's vision, Jerry's vision, Larry's vision, to your knowledge, like from kind of where you were sitting? Who presented that idea that you just mentioned, that it's going to be Jerry going through his stand-up life and how he gets his ideas? Was that Jerry and Larry coming to the table with that? Or was that Ludwin saying, here's what I think you should do? Or was it a combination? Or, do you remember anything around that?
Yeah, I remember it vividly. Yes. And it was very clearly, all of the creative choices were Larry and Jerry. Everything about the direction of the thing. I shouldn't say everything. There were some times later in seasons where the network tried to influence the show in ways that ultimately didn't work out. Notably where Jerry and Elaine actually, have a relationship, or a physical relationship. And that was something NBC was pushing for, not Rick Ludwin, others at NBC. Oh, we think this would be good. It didn't work. And they reversed. That was one notable time when it wasn't Larry or Jerry's idea. The creative was Larry and Jerry. To Rick Ludwin's credit, that dynamic even existed. The truth is, in the vast, vast majority, and guys, you mentioned my humble background. I've been fired by almost every major network and studio you can mention. So I've seen a lot of different things. The vast majority of executives have a very heavy hand. They think they know best. They give notes. And in some cases they do. Sometimes there are considerations that a network executive would be uniquely positioned to know. And sometimes they just have good taste. And sometimes but not always. In fact, I think that would be a generous characterization of it. What Rick Ludwin's strength was as an executive was he believed in Jerry and Larry, but mostly Jerry was the one he really liked, and Larry is his own genius. And he felt like, look, who am I ultimately? We can give notes. Jeremiah, you and I can give notes on scripts. And we did. We gave notes on like the Chinese restaurant. And I can tell you stories, but, and it's like, who the fuck are these guys for us to be telling ultimately, Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld? The irony was, even if at that time they weren't the Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld they are today, they were those people. They did have those instincts and abilities. And so who are we to tell them, oh, we think this is the direction, the character? So we tried to, Rick and I, me following Rick's lead, tried to really just support them as best we could, even in times when we didn't agree with them. And in retrospect, the Chinese restaurant's a great example. We didn't get that episode. Rick and I did not understand it. And we were really concerned. We had some real conversations with Jerry and Larry and the Castle Rock executives where we talked about our concerns, misguided, though history has shown they all were. But not to pat ourselves on the back, but I would say that what was different about Rick Ludwin and what I learned from him and what I tried to do in my own career as an executive was to entrust the creatives that you're hiring and you're paying, that the choices they're making, it's their vision for the show. And yes, the network is spending a lot of money, and to a very real extent, network executives' careers can be on the line if you take too many swings that miss. You're not going to be an executive at that place for long. And if you have a hit, it can be very good for the executive as well as the creative team. But really, it's a judgment about empowerment. And so, in answer to your question, not to beat a dead horse, but it was Jerry and Larry leading the charge creatively, and Rick Ludwin consistently. And if you were to ask, I believe, if you were to ask Jerry Seinfeld or Larry David that same question, they would say the thing about Rick Ludwin was he consistently supported us. Funnily enough, though, Larry and Jerry really didn't know any better, because it's not like at the time they were these grizzled, sitcom writers who, we've worked through so many different fucking executives and they all give shitty notes and you got a list. They didn't know any better. Larry David did not know how good he had it, how big a supporter and great a supporter he had in Rick Ludwin that he did. Yeah. And I think now Larry appreciates it. I believe, but at the time, I don't think, just because they didn't know. Larry had never run a television show at that time. By the way, those first episodes, I'm sorry, I'm just talking over you guys.
No, it's great.
I should shut up and let you ask something, but
it's great.
In the beginning, there was a showrunner, an executive producer over Larry David, because Larry David wasn't a quote unquote network approved, which is a term used, network approved showrunner. He had never been an executive producer, and he was a friend of Jerry's. In answer to an earlier question, when you said, how did it evolve? Rick Ludwin had a meeting, this is before my time, but I know it to be true, met with Jerry Seinfeld and his manager, George Shapiro, and he said, look, I really am a fan, Jerry, I really like you. What would you like to do? That was Rick's approach. Not like, here's this idea I have for you. You run an ice cream shop, and that's the way a lot of other executives approach it. They have concepts, and then they try to fit the talent into those concepts. And that can often work. But Rick was like, look, I believe in you. What do you want to do? And Jerry had not really even thought about it. At the time, he was like, I don't know. I'm going to go. Let me think about it. And he went and he talked to his friend, Larry David. And he said, if we had a show, probably in a place like Monk's is where they probably sat and talked about it. What would it be? And, they came up with this idea, the show about nothing, which is a little bit of BS, I think, to say, because it always is about something, however, non-existential it is. And it was their idea for this is how the show would evolve. This is what it would be. And they brought that to Rick. And he said, okay, let's see if we could do it. And George Shapiro, I think he's related somehow to Carl Reiner. And Carl's son, Rob Reiner, the famous actor-director, was
Castle Rock.
Say again?
He founded Castle Rock, right?
Yes. Well, yeah. I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought. So Rob Reiner was one of the four founding partners of Castle Rock. And so George said, my cousin or something, his son has this production company. They're creative. It's new. Let's bring them in. And that's how Castle Rock got involved in being the studio of choice. It wasn't one of the big powerhouse, Paramount, Universal, 20th Television. Those studios didn't bring their comedy ideas to Rick Ludwin, or they would be going to the comedy development team. So it was this little production company that totally, it was the biggest hit imaginable for them too.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the vision of Jerry. We talked to Matt Goldman, who was a writer early on.
Of course,
and he told
Matt
us
was great.
Yeah, he told us this great story that I'm curious if you have a similar story. Maybe you even were a part of this one, where basically an exec, was giving Jerry notes on a show, the next show, or how he wanted the next show to go, and Jerry basically told him, I'm doing the show my way, and if you don't like it, I'll just leave. Basically, he just had his stand up and was stood up to this guy and just said, listen, it's my vision. We're going to do it this way. And he also mentioned that Larry David, to your point before about not being approved. At this point, Larry David wasn't even allowed in these meetings, apparently, because he was too volatile. What can you tell us about that, with Jerry's kind of vision and standing up to the execs, and then kind of Larry just being, like you said, kind of off to the side, just in a new world, and kind of not even dealing with the execs at all. That's an interesting dynamic. I'd love to get your.
Yeah. So I don't remember. I don't remember that exactly. I hope Matt was not thinking, it was this douchebag executive Jeremiah Bosgang, and Jerry really put him in his place. I hope he wasn't thinking of me, because, but no, I don't think it was me. I'm pretty sure it wasn't.
I think it was the president, is what he said. The president.
Oh, wow. Well, that might have come at a later time. In the early days, even though I don't think Larry David never thought the show was going to go beyond 4 episodes or something. He just thought it was this weird thing he was helping Jerry with, and they moved back to New York, and it would be over. I remember when the show got picked up for, as you were saying, like season 2. I remember, I think that to woo Larry, Jerry bought Larry a car in LA to kind of say, hey, come on, come back and do this. I think he got him like some kind of like a Lexus or something. I could be mistaken, but I have a memory of that somehow. But there was definitely a feeling, and even Jerry, maybe not like with a swagger to it, but like, look, I have a career. I make a really great living doing something I love in stand-up comedy. I don't need the sitcom to work. If it can work and be something that I don't feel creatively compromised, that I actually enjoy, great. But it doesn't have to go for 4 seasons or something, and although the money would be great, that wasn't what was motivating those guys. They were really wanting to do something that they would want to watch and that they would find funny and engaging. And so, yes, Larry in the early days, I think, he could be difficult. But he could also be really, really good guy. I haven't seen him in years, but he back then, he was a good guy. And I think he's softened even more with his subsequent, not only the gargantuan Seinfeld success, but then he does it again with Curb. I mean, so, that kind of success, I think, softens somebody who, might be otherwise feeling resentful at times, or, Larry was so famous for like yelling at an audience, or if they didn't get what he now knows how, it's been confirmed so many times over how great he is by so many that I think that's probably softened him. In any event, yes, it was difficult and in the beginning, because as creative as the guys were and are, they didn't have like some of the basic television development vocabulary, just working on a certain schedule and having to turn things around in a certain time frame and rewrite, very mechanical skills, but still important to, if you're not just doing a 4-part special, if you have a weekly show, you need to really be on a schedule. And so that's a skill that's developed, that somebody develops out, as opposed to your own sensibility and taste judgment, which you either have or don't. So clearly the guys developed it well over the years, but maybe in the beginning, there might have been some challenge to it.
Yeah. And speaking of the beginning, you touched on this. I mean, Ludwin gets a ton of credit for sure. And you mentioned Castle Rock. So like the players, right? There's Ludwin, there's Warren Littlefield, who was supposedly Russell, Brandon Tartikoff, of course. You had Glenn Padnick at Castle Rock. Like, so all these guys in a room, like, and then I'm always thinking about, I heard that someone told us that Warren Littlefield stepped in and said Michael Richards has to be Kramer. We can't hire anyone else. I'm like, what do you remember about those early days on casting? Right, like, hey, is Jason Alexander the guy? Is that the guy we envisioned for this? Like, you had to be in the room, right, with kind of those conversations with Hirschfeld and all these guys.
Yeah. So the cast was set. Jerry, Jason, Julia, and Michael, before I came on. They were in that, as you talked about, the pilot, the first episode, and that was before I was there. And so I can't say who said what or didn't. I can tell you, as incredibly talented as Warren Littlefield is, and he had an amazing career as an executive at NBC, and now he's like this preeminent producer of like so many hit shows and top shelf dramas and things. But in all candor, Warren wasn't as supportive of Seinfeld in those early days. And I think he'd cop to this too, if you put him right on the spot. Certainly not to the way Rick was. If anything, there was a bit of internal competition between the conventional development teams that Warren oversaw, and Rick's area, Seinfeld specifically. It was never really taken too seriously internally at NBC in the early stages. It was always this kind of like, oh yeah, that's like the Rick and Jeremiah's thing, but it wasn't the real. There was a show at the time, to give you an example. I don't know if you remember, the darling of the development teams headed up by Warren was a show called Wings.
Wings, yeah.
And now, in all fairness to Warren and those people, that show came from Paramount. Paramount was the producer of Cheers, which was the gargantuan hit for NBC at that time, Thursday nights at 8 o'clock. I think it was 8 o'clock. No, 9 o'clock was Cheers. 8 o'clock, I think, was Cosby. Anyway, so in their renewal negotiations for Cheers to come back for whatever it was, the 8th season, 9th season, Paramount had tremendous leverage. And one of the things they negotiated for, this is like a little behind the scenes thing, was that they would have first crack at the time slot following Cheers, that a show they developed would get that plum lead-in of Cheers. And the show that they developed and that NBC was betting on, and that was developed by some former Cheers writer-producers, so people with a real pedigree, really smart, talented, funny people, was this show Wings. And then Rick and I were like the little David to that Goliath of like saying, well, could Seinfeld have a shot coming out of, is there any chance? Like, we'd be at the scheduling meetings, and even Brandon would be rolling his up, Brandon Tartikoff, who was a real supporter of Seinfeld, but he'd kind of be rolling his eyes like, guys, you got to be kidding me. You know, you're at the big boy table now. No, Seinfeld it's going to be like Wings or something, some other show that's developed by Emmy Award winning writer producers, not some Weird guy from New York that no one's ever heard of, Larry David. You know, it's going to be by these people with this, you know, Ivy League pedigree of television writing. And Warren was in that camp. So I'm not trying to take anything away from anybody, but just to set the record straight. Now, as Seinfeld did eventually get those shots, and it started to show it had traction, Brandon Tartikoff is the one who saw that and allowed for it to be scheduled and get a number of runs on those Thursday nights, which were critical to exposing it to an audience and showing that it could retain that Cheers lead-in. And then, you know, the rest is history, as we say. And then, of course, when Brandon left and Warren became the president of NBC, he was a staunch supporter of Seinfeld and he believed in it. And but just in those early days, it was a little different dynamic.
Yeah, we spoke with Preston Beckman, who was the lead of, you know him, the lead of scheduling, and he had some great stories about that and Wings, and he told that similar story, I think, about Paramount. Would love to. You mentioned a Chinese restaurant. I'd love to hear some other examples. You know, one of our favorite episodes, actually our favorite episode of all time, not many's, is the phone message. Where, you know, coffee's not coffee, coffee's not. Anyway, that episode actually replaced The Bet, which was the Larry Charles episode written about a gun. Do you remember that episode? Because I know it was close to being produced, and then I don't know who pulled it exactly, if that was you with Ludwin or what went on there, but would love to hear, if not that story, any other ways you were critical of a script or anything like that. Would love to hear.
Sure. I don't remember exactly. I don't believe that it was Rick, or certainly not me. I wasn't in a position to pull anything anyway. But I don't believe it was us. We may have talked about our reservations about an episode like being too dark or something. But again, I really do. I'm not just saying this. I really do recall that we would say, "Hey guys, ultimately it's your decision. You know, what you want to do and what you want to go with it." And that plays right into Chinese restaurant, which I do remember much more clearly. So it was at a critical time that episode was written. And you guys probably remember better than me. What episode number was that? Do you know offhand?
16, I believe.
So it was like at the point where I remember we were waiting. Every episode, when a show is in that early stage, every episode is so delicate in terms of the ratings it produces, because there are all these different people, Preston Beckman and research groups and research teams, and they're analyzing the different demographics of the episode. And it went up a tenth of a point here, it dropped off a fraction of a point there. And those decisions it really bear heavily on the ultimate decision that the network president at the time, Brandon Tartikoff or Warren Littlefield, makes about a show's renewal or where it goes on the schedule. They take all these things into consideration. And so as the development person of the show, you're very protective and wanting to obviously get the best ratings you can and not do things that could hurt. And when Rick and I read The Chinese Restaurant, we got this first draft. It was what's the story? There's no story here. Nothing really does happen in that episode. If anything, that was an episode that was fair to say nothing happens. The whole thing is in real time waiting for a table. And there's the great banter and character-driven dialogue between the cast, but it was so different. We didn't get it. We didn't see it. And we were very concerned in the context I just gave about ratings that, like, oh my God, if this thing, this is going to be a death knell to the show. I mean, if you do an episode that's really weak and our colleagues at the network, run it through all these metrics and stuff, and it doesn't hold up, it could really be like, no, that was a big miss, and we can't afford to take big misses like that. And so I remember one memory I have, and it was just Rick and me. We had got so the way it would work is we'd get the script, a version of the script, the first draft, the network, we would read it. Then we would go to a table reading at the studio. The cast would be sitting around, as I'm sure like a big table, and you'd have all the department heads, wardrobe and camera, and the studio executives, the network executives, which were Rick and me, and the director at the head of the table. I think it was Tom Sharonis at that time was the director. And, and the cast would read through the episode. And so then after the read through, then the senior writing staff and the studio executives and network executives would go off for a notes meeting where the network would give some notes. And, and I remember Rick and I, before we went to the table reading, I drove in my car from NBC in Burbank over to the studios for Seinfeld were at this lot called the Radcliffe lot. I don't know if that might be a well-known Seinfeld trivia. I don't know. But anyway, and as we were driving over, we were saying, what are we going to do? I mean, it's not like we even have like a basic note of like, oh, you guys decide what you want to do. But this one beat with, Elaine, it doesn't work as well for us. Or, this is like fundamentally, we don't get this episode. We don't understand it. It doesn't, there's no story. All of the most basic things in sitcom writing 101 that executives know and look for, it didn't have. And Rick and I were in my car, and he asked me my opinion. He said, should we let them do this? Should we stop, just say the network is not going to pay for this? You guys cannot proceed with this episode. At that time, the balance of power was such that theoretically NBC could have said that. When Seinfeld became the white hot hit and the cast was on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, there was no NBC executive who was going to say, "Oh, you guys can't do this." It was because it was so established how great everything was. But at that,
but Jeremiah, this is hot off The Statue, The Phone Message, some really funny shows. Hey, there it is.
I was waiting to reveal this to you guys, and then I see, Tony, where did you get that?
Yeah, so shout out to one of our fans. We had a fan who actually found this in some like thrift store, casted himself, painted it himself.
Oh,
Shout out Alien Wrangler. I think he's still selling a couple more on Etsy, but he sent us this one to he found like a replica.
This is an actual one. You can see how it's broken here.
Yes.
This because in the end at that episode, they freeze frame and it falls and breaks. And so after the episode, I picked up the pieces and I glued it, and no one else is going to want it. And so, but that's the exact color, and you wouldn't know which is authentic or not.
Yeah. That's
anyway, I'm sorry, Chris. You asked me something, and I didn't answer what you asked me.
No, we had Ray on from that episode. He's fantastic.
Oh, funny.
I don't know what my question was.
Yeah, it was. It was something about you were saying they already did have a lot of momentum, and the show already
was to a viewer, to the Wednesday night viewer, and we always preferred it on Wednesday night. Believe it or not,
yeah, we're Wednesday guys.
It was, but like I say, the conversation that Rick and I had could only have happened at that earlier stage in the show's evolution, and we both agreed that we didn't get the Chinese restaurant. I had shared it with some colleagues at NBC, some people who I trusted, who I knew really liked Seinfeld and were really disposed to supporting it. And they were like, dude, no, I don't get this. This is a misstep. This is definitely a misstep. And so, but ultimately, and again, it's that Rick Ludwin philosophy. He was like, I'm going to tell them that it's their decision to make, but I am going to voice my concern. And he voiced his concern. And I remember Larry David was livid. He was so angry. And I really thought Larry was out of line. He was like, because he really Rick Ludwin, you have to understand, is this really kind-hearted, sweet guy. He's from a real Midwesterner from Cleveland, just polite, rarely curses, just a gentleman, good guy. And I remember, at least Larry, I remember vividly because I was sitting in the room where we give notes, and there were windows all around on the first floor. And Larry, to his credit, had the courtesy to say, Rick, may I speak to you? And they stepped outside, and I could see them like a silent movie, like when you turn the sound down. I could see them out the window, and I see Larry David is and lacing into poor Rick, who's the nicest guy and doesn't raise his voice. Rick is just listening, but even Rick has his limits. But Larry was so angry, and and Rick didn't say you can't do it. He just said, look, we think that you should try a different approach or a different idea. If this is the type of episode you want to do, let's save it for, once we get our next episode order. Let's get past this hurdle, this hump that we're up against. But if you want to do it, Larry and Jerry, it's your show. And to their credit, they said, yeah, this is what we want to do. We do believe in it. And they did it, and we ultimately supported them in doing it. And we took a lot of heat internally at NBC. It was like as though we were stupid. We weren't sophisticated development executives. How could you let this kind of thing happen? There was a lot of that, although people with the passage of time tend to forget those positions. I don't. I remember them well. History bears it out for what it is. But so I don't know if I answered your question in any of that.
No, you did. This is fantastic too. And we mentioned a few names there, and a little earlier on too. I mean, I'm curious how much. I mean, early on we talked about the show's not about anything, or that people like to say that, or whatever. But like you mentioned, it actually was about a lot. And early on, it. Especially Larry Charles's episodes, kind of dark. It was just different than anything else. I mean, aside from the Chinese restaurant, just all of the episodes, the statue, all of these episodes were so much different than your what was on TV than sitcoms, right? So I'm curious how much the rest of kind of the supporting cast played a role in kind of you and Rick getting behind the show and kind of seeing their vision with Larry Charles and Tom Sharonis as the director, who I know, you bought a car from him, right? Is that right? And I'm sure you have some stories about him. I think it was in Seinfeldia, I believe.
Oh,
I think it was in Jennifer's book. We spoke with her as well. But
okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I just we're big fans of Larry Charles, Peter Melman, and Tom Sharon's kind of there at the beginning. Yeah, and curious like how much they were, involved. I know obviously everyone hits their wagon to Larry and Jerry ultimately, but without them there, especially Larry Charles and Melman and Sharon's kind of, churning out these episodes and putting their stamp on things. I'm sure that it's something to do with kind of everyone kind of getting behind the show. Just kind of curious your thoughts on those.
All of those guys, all of them definitely had impact. I mean, I would say, listen, Tom Sharonis was the director in the beginning. He really set the style. He was the most experienced, one of the more experienced television people outside of the Castle Rock executives. Glenn Padnick had many years experience, obviously, Rob Reiner and Alan Horn. But Tom was had the most conventional television experience and scheduling and rehearsal and setups, and Larry and Jerry had virtually none, and here they were starring in the show and running the show ultimately. Larry Charles is, as I'm sure really brilliant writer, but not at that time, not an experienced television writer. He was someone who was friends with, I think, Larry David, and he had just that really unique voice and approach that Larry loved, and Melman is similarly, not a conventional sitcom writer. None of those guys. Melman was, with Howard Cosell doing Wide World of Sports and Washington Post, and he's an old Maryland grad. So I first met Peter. I love Peter Melman, just a great guy and so funny. But I met him years before, back when I was in New York, that struggling actor wannabe. He was a segment producer on a daytime talk show. A friend of mine who was a producer with Melman, Sandy Gillis, got me a little bit part on the show. It was a show with Linda Dano and Sharon Gless. I forget the name of the show, but it was on Lifetime, and they were the two hosts. And I came on as this Mr. Fix-It. And I would come on and I would explain how to fix a leaky sink because I was a building superintendent in New York. And that was like before I did that work in LA with electronics and stuff.
The AV guy, yeah.
That's how I supported myself as an actor, as I took care of this apartment building and I did the handyman job. So I came on as a character where I was Mr. Fix-It. And I did this thing with a hair lip where I came on and I was like, if you really want to if you have a leaky sink, the thing you need to do, it's not very sexy, but what you want to do is and I would like just demonstrate how to do this thing. And Melman was a segment producer on the show. And I think you'd have to ask him, but I think he thought it was interesting or something that I did. And he and I became friends. And this was many years before I was an NBC executive, before he would be on Seinfeld. And then our paths would cross again, like years later in LA.
What a small world. Yeah, Melman tells us he just happened to bump into Larry at a party, I think in Long Island, in the Hamptons or something. And he said, "Hey, you want to come?" And that was it. It was happenstance. And then he gave us some of the greatest episodes.
Yes.
Actually, Jeremiah, so when did you leave? I'm trying to get a timeline of when was it.
I was there for really not even a year, and the episodes, as Tony was saying before, it was kind of weird. Episodes 1 through 4, and then I was obviously there for 16, which was. But you guys know the episodes better than I. But
Keith Hernandez year.
The busboy ended season 2. The busboy ended season 2. His Chinese restaurant, then busboy ended season 2, and then the note, the truth, the pen, the dog. Those all started season 3.
It must have been before season 3, or so. What happened was for me, So I told you a little bit about the dynamics of network executives, how the real what's the word I'm looking for? The more mainstream, the thick of it is comedy development or drama development. Now, the comedy development people at NBC were very ensconced, and they were very successful, and no one was going anywhere. So there was no room, if you aspired to do that, to stay at NBC. But due in part to the success of Seinfeld and the halo effect of my being involved with it, I was offered a job as the director of comedy development at Fox, the fledgling Fox Broadcasting Company, working under an executive who would become one of my best friends, and he would go on to a very successful career as an executive himself, Tom Noonan. He was the vice president of comedy development. Peter Chernin was the president of Fox Broadcasting Company at the time. So I had this opportunity to go from being a manager of specials, variety, and late night programming to director of comedy development. And that was, for me, and I think most people would say, oh, that's a big step up. And so I left NBC to go and pursue that. And it was probably around that end of season 2.
So what were you, like 20? Were you like 28 at the time? You're a young guy. Yeah. You were a young guy.
I was 29. I remember because I just got married around then. So I was like 29, 30.
Was Siobhan Fallon at your wedding?
Siobhan Fallon introduced me on a blind date to the woman I married and my wife of 30 years. So Siobhan was this platonic close friend that those improv groups and comedy clubs I mentioned in New York.
Yeah.
Siobhan and I were in the same comedy improv comedy, this now defunct club that no longer exists called Who's on First. It was on First Avenue in like 61st Street or something. And Siobhan and I were really good friends, platonic friends. Although I kind of had a crush on her. I always thought she was really so funny. And then we had moved to LA, and Siobhan and I were going to do a show together. When we were both in LA before I got that job at NBC, and we were going to do the Siobhan and Jeremiah comedy hour, and it was going to be the two of us doing these sketches and stuff together. We were going to get a little theater, and then I got into a car accident, and I broke my leg, and I couldn't do it. So Siobhan went on and just did a one-woman show, and I ran the lights for her and the sound. I was her sound and lights guy, and it was off of that show that she got cast in Saturday Night Live.
Wow.
And Siobhan.
And then obviously she was on Seinfeld on season 2 when you were there.
So Siobhan is like one of the funniest, most talented people. And but
Jerry, it
was definitely as a good, like one of her close friends who was going to do this show with her. And maybe I would have been the dead weight and Siobhan would have been the really funny one. But I mean, I was always like, oh shit. I remember she got interviewed by the LA Times because her show was really popular. And I don't know if she had just already gotten cast in cast on Saturday Night Live, but a lot of people were paying attention. And Siobhan, to try to include me, said you really should talk to my friend Jeremiah, to the LA Times writer, because he knows the show, he knows me. We were going to do the show together. So as a gratuitous bone, this writer interviewed me and asked me for some quotes, and I said a bunch of different stuff. And in the LA Times article, she quotes it as Jeremiah Bosgang, W-A-N-G. So my friends all started calling me, hey, Wang. That became my nickname because it was like my big quote in the LA Times. And Siobhan Fallon is going to be a star of Saturday Night Live. And the Wang is like doing the lights and sweeping the stage after. But it was sometime after that Jim Stein introduced me to Rick Ludwin, and I got the job at NBC. And I was one of the people who put Siobhan Fallon, her name out there to Mark Hirschfeld to get her on Mark's radar. Mark, who you guys have had Mark on.
Yeah.
He's another awesome, just sweetheart guy, really talented. But Yeah. And then Siobhan got, the role on Seinfeld. She's done Lars von Trier movies and also, as you know, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, we talked to Siobhan.
Yeah,
she was wonderful. I'm wondering, we were just talking about, you were there at the end of season 2, right? And that was kind of there, was that weird 13 episode season that everyone talks about. It's unheard of in sitcoms and what have you, right? So how close in your mind, percentage wise, or maybe just kind of being there, like how close was it to not getting picked up for that, like season 3? I mean, were they sweating it? Was it something where you weren't sure?
Absolutely.
I mean, how close?
I mean, it's hard to quantify how close, but I can tell you it was not a slam dunk. It was not, oh my God, this show is going to be what it became. And that's a real hump to get over, that season 2 to season 3 hump. Anybody who's had a show that's like a big bar, because sometimes you can have a show that it has the first season, it shows some promise. It's not an out of the gate hit. But the network has invested enough in the marketing and sales of the show, trying to create an awareness, which is, millions and millions of dollars is spent on that. And so getting that pickup to season 2, that's not, in my view, as high a bar as the pickup from season 2 to season 3, because by the end of season 2, you're looking as an executive, okay, now where are we at? What's the show generating ratings wise, which of course has a direct impact on what the advertising rates are for that show. And because by the 3rd season, so that's a very big bar. And I can guarantee you that solid performer, though Seinfeld may have been in many ways, it was not a slam dunk thing.
Yeah. Crazy. It's just to think about that. And then so season 4, they obviously do the show within the show, right? We talked about it earlier, right?
Yeah.
And famously, they cast, you basically, right? And you auditioned for that part. I mean, tell us about that, how Jay Crespi came to be when it was originally going to be, Jeremiah Bosgang. That's an interesting story. We'd love to hear that.
It's so funny talking to you guys about this stuff, because like you're just saying Jay Crespi, like, I've told this story, as you know, to Jennifer and people, and you kind of have to tell people or put it in context, but you understand. So you set the table perfectly. So I had left Fox. I was at Fox for about a year when I left to have this guest writer tryout at Saturday Night Live. And I left my executive job to do this, only to not be offered a staff job in the following season. That's kind of like, at the time at Saturday Night Live, that was the way writers could be tried out. You get 1 or 2 or 3 episodes as a guest writer, and it would be a look-see opportunity, how they fit in. And then maybe if there's an opening in the following season, one of those guest writers might be offered a role, but I was not. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I came back to LA and I got a job on staff on In Living Color as a writer on In Living Color. And so I remember I was in my office at In Living Color, and I get a phone call from this friend of mine who's an actor, very talented actor. His name is Ron Fassler. If you would recognize him, Ron has done a lot of different stuff, and I haven't spoken to him in years. But so Ron calls me and he says, he's like, "Hey, Jeremiah." I'm like, "Hey, Ron, and what's going on?" He's like, "Dude, I just got out of the weirdest audition." So this is like actor talk, right, to each other. I'm like, "Oh, really? Like, what was so weird about it?" And he's like, "Well, I was auditioning for a character named Jeremiah Bosgang." And I'm like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah." He goes, "Over at Seinfeld." He goes, "Seinfeld." And so they, in LA and New York, they have these things called the breakdowns, the casting breakdowns that go out to all the different agents each day. And it lists the shows that are casting the character. And so it'll say, Susan blah blah blah, leggy blonde, 20s. And then there was apparently a line that said Jeremiah Bosgang, probably short, bald executive type or something. I don't know. I really don't know what the description was, Ron is not bald, so it didn't specify bald, but probably said character actor, Jeremiah Bosgang, young executive. They were used my name in the breakdown. I was like, what the? And so I was like, well, thanks for telling me, Ron. So I hang up with him and I call Jerry's manager, George Shapiro.
Right.
I know I keep using this term when I'm talking about Seinfeld people, but truly one of the nicest people. There were a lot of people on that show associated on every level who were just really nice, good people. And George was like the epitome of that, the sweetest, really good guy. And he just passed away recently, very sadly. But so I called George and I said, hey, George. And now I hadn't spoken to these guys in like a couple of years, because remember, I left NBC, I worked at Fox, and I left Fox, and now I'm in Living Color. So maybe it was 18 months or something. And I was like, yeah. And by now the show is a bona fide hit. From the time I left, when I left, it was like the dead weight had left and now the show takes off. And it's a really huge hit, really, and building. And I said to George, hey, I hear there's a Jeremiah Bosgang character. And he's like, oh, yeah, and he tells me the story. He goes, the guys are going to arc out over the course of the season how they developed the show, with you and Rick. And so I'm like, George, how about Jeremiah Bosgang as himself? And so there's this
it's like Kramer wanted to play Kramer, right?
Yes. And so there's this like, Science goes, oh, well, we didn't, are you an actor? And I'm like, George, I toured with Second City. I'm writing for In Living Color right now. I mean, yeah. And he said, well, all right, let me talk to the guys. I'll get back to you. Hangs up. Maybe like an hour and a half later, I get a phone call. It's George Shapiro. He's like, hey, I talked to the guys, meaning Larry and Jerry. And if you'd like to come in and audition, they would see you for today. I'm like, audition? I mean, the character is named Jeremiah Bosgang. I mean, do you need a French accent or something? I mean, what? And so he goes, but the thing is, they're seeing people today. The episode tapes later this week, because it was just a featured part. It wasn't like any bit. And so he said, so you'd have to get down to you'd have to get over to Radcliffe, the studios. So I'm over at In Living Colors on the other side of town. So I'm like, I'm on my way. I get in my car, Tom Sharonis's car, old car, and I'm driving across town, and I still have the sticker. So one of the ways that you could drive onto a lot back then, now I'm sure security with 9/11, everything has changed, but back then you just have a little decal in your window. I still had that on my car. So I pull up, the guy just waves to me, lets me drive right in. And I pull up to the studio, the offices where Seinfeld was. And it was so weird because when I was there, Seinfeld was this little, very small budget, modest budget sitcom. It wasn't like a bit. So they were in the same studio, but it was completely renovated. There's a big sign that says Seinfeld, new shrubberies planted, all shrubs and bushes in front. And like, I think it's now a 3-story building. It was it just, oh my God. But I park and I go in, and there's this, you go in and there's a receptionist, excuse me, before you go anywhere. And this really cute girl, and she's like, can I help you? And I said, yeah, I'm here to audition. And she's, oh, that's casting. That's the 3rd door down. And I'm like, casting? It used to just be, oh yeah, someone will be out to see you in a few minutes. Now there are all these different rooms and offices. So I go down this hall, I go in another door, and it's the casting office. And there's another really cute receptionist. And there are a couple of guys sitting around the room on couches. And have you ever heard the term, I'm sorry if I'm patronizing you, but sides? So sides are the excerpts from the script that the actor is going to need for the audition for that scene. So they're all looking at their sides. It's 1 or 2 script pieces, and they're like 4 or 5, 3, 5 guys sitting around. Really quiet. And when I come in, I'm a little out of breath. I go up to the receptionist. She's like, can I help you? And I said, yeah, hi, I'm here to audition for the episode. She goes, okay. She said, what is your name? And she has a list that she's checking names on. So I go, Jeremiah Bosgang. And she goes, no, not the character's name. What is your name? And so I go, no, I said, actually, I am Jeremiah Bosgang. And like, she's like looking at me like, and like, oh, one of these method actors. I am Julius Caesar, and it's like, and all the guys like who are sitting around, they can hear what I'm saying. And they're all like, what a douchebag. The guy comes in and says, I am the character, I am. So she goes, okay, like she's humoring me. Okay, Jeremiah. And she hands me the sides and she goes, they'll call you when they're ready. And so I go to sit down. The guys all move away from me. No one wants to sit near this asshole who's saying, I am, I am whatever.
Oh,
so
man.
I'm looking at the sides and I'm sitting there. And then this door to another room opens up and an actor comes out. And I see inside the room, I see there's Larry and Jerry and I think Glenn Padnick. And they see me. And I hadn't seen them for a couple of years. And they're like, they come out and they're really friendly. They're like, Jeremiah. And we're hugging each other. And on cue, all the guys sitting around like, they throw their sides up in the air like, fuck this. Here's Jeremiah Bosgang. And they take me right in and I go in and what have you been up to? What have you been doing? And I'm telling them the whole story about, Saturday Night Live and how it was a bust and I didn't do well. And, but now I'm in Living Color and, and they're like, oh, wow. And, they're obviously the show's doing really well. And if you remember the part of the bit with that character, at least in the early drafts of the script, that, Jason George was doing this thing where he'd be like, Chris O'Hara, Ohara, and he'd like spell things.
Names. Yeah.
And then so that's what he would do. So the thing was in the scene, it was like 3 lines that I was practicing. They were like, Jeremiah Bosgang. I'd be like, hi, Jeremiah Bosgang. They'd Bosgang, Bosgang. And my line was like, that's right. That's all I had to say. That's right. And these fucking guys had me do it. Like Larry, I don't know to this day if they were fucking with me or what. Larry was like, all right, now can you do it like you're a little nervous? And I'm like, that's right. All right, well, good. Now can you do it like you're angry? And they're like, Bosgang. I'm like, that's right. And they're like, okay, now can you do it like you're really happy? They just made me do it like, that's right, like 20 different ways. But I was like, oh, this is fun, whatever. And so we're like, oh, thanks a lot. It was great to see you, blah, blah, blah. And I'm walking out and going, I got this. Right. It's Jeremiah Bosgang. It's like, that's right. And I go back to my office and I'm waiting for the phone to ring because like I got to know, it's going to tape this week. What time? Where do I go? Do I have to go to wardrobe? Do I bring my own wardrobe? No phone call. So the next day I called George Shapiro. And I'm like, George, hey, and he's like, hey, Jeremiah. And I'm like, I think I said, oh yeah. So, I don't want to be presumptuous, but what do I do? I'm not sure, like, do I have to fill any forms out or where do I go? And he's like, oh, nobody called you? The guys didn't call you? And I was like, no, nobody called me. He said, oh, I'm sorry, Jerry. I know Jerry wanted to call you and Larry, they were going to call you. And I was like, oh, and he said, yeah, they might want to go in a different direction with the Jeremiah Bosgang character. In fact, they're going to change the name. It's not going to be Jeremiah Bosgang. And you know what? They might do something with some of these executive characters, like that's a little offbeat or weird. And they don't want any kind of an implication that the real people did it or the real people were involved. And so my big Hollywood story is I couldn't get cast to play myself on a television show. That kind of speaks volumes about my whole career. But the truth is, in all fairness to the guys, you might remember, so the Bob Balaban, the actor who played the character loosely based on Warren Littlefield, actually becomes infatuated, as you might, with Elaine, right?
Yes.
Right.
And that never happened. That was the kind of twist. They didn't do it with the Jay Crespi character, but they did do it with the network head character. And so years later, I remember I saw Jerry, and And he was like, hey, by the way, I'm sorry about that thing. Like he knew that it didn't work out and getting cast. I said, oh, whatever. He said, Jeremiah, the problem was you just weren't Jeremiah Bosgang enough. Thanks, Jerry.
But, that's a great story. And the other takeaway from when you came on set, Seinfeld had pretty girls as his girlfriend, and it seems like as receptionist at the Radnor slot. But anyway, so Jeremiah, if you took off your executive hat and just as a fan of the show, because that's what we are, frankly, right. We try to analyze best we can. But seasons 1, in my opinion, the show could have ended after season 5, and I would have been happy. I think Sharonis leaving, Larry Charles leaving, and then to another degree, obviously, when Larry left after season 7, it just became a completely different show. Would love your take on kind of how you saw the show evolve, good or bad. We all have our own opinions on it. For us, it became a little too cartoonish. It's still funny, but just a different type of show. Would love your kind of take, even as an executive or a fan, based on that.
Well, you just characterized it so perfectly that it was that the show evolved and it changed. Some people I know prefer the later seasons, but I think that part of what made that show successful, where it was able to run for the seasons it did, was that it did evolve and it did change. And I think in a similar way, you see a similar kind of dynamic with musical artists. Like in the music business, there's a term, career artist. That's like not just someone who, has an album or two that are hits, but who really like has a career and evolves as an artist and over years. And in television, the lifespan might be even shorter for a career, but for a show to run, like you say, beyond 5 seasons, 6, 7, 8 seasons, it has to evolve in some ways. And that's why you see new characters are introduced or things. And in Seinfeld's case, there was an evolution in just the kinds of storytelling and the writing that came in, the writers that came in. And for somebody who really loved the early, look, there are people who hate the early episodes and think they're really boring and, or just awkward or whatever. And then there are people who love them. So it's such a subjective thing. But the fact is that it had picked up, it already was so popular and so successful. And you see that with a lot of shows, a lot of series, not just comedies, but by the time they get into, there's that wave of the early adapters who get a show and love it early on. Even Curb Your Enthusiasm is another great example. Yeah. Like there were people who didn't care for it in the early, oh, he's an embittered or whatever, they would be dismissive. But other people like, no, this is really good and it's really different. And it grew and it got stronger. And now there are some people who will say in the later episodes, maybe using some of that same criticism, it's cartoony or it's a little over the top, but other people who love it and say, oh no, I love all the crisscrossing stories and the way it ties together and the characters. Yes, some of them are over the top, but I love Leon or I love whoever it is. So I know I'm not being very committal here, but I'm obviously partial to the early days because that's when I was on the show and I have really fond memories, but I look at later episodes and I enjoy them. And some of my really close friends were writer producers in later years, Tom Gamble and Max Pross, who again, I knew those guys way before when I was an intern at Late Night with David Letterman. That's where I met
Steve O'Donnell too, right? Did you know Steve O'Donnell at Letterman also?
Steve O'Donnell was at, I met Steve at Late Night with David Letterman when he was a cub writer before he became the head writer, when he was just the new guy who joined the writing staff. So I really, and there are some personal stories between me and Tom and me and Max that became episodes of Seinfeld. And it had nothing to do with my being an executive. It's just because I knew them, and one of the things Larry David loves to do is mine.
Yeah. Do you have an example of one of those?
Oh, sure. Okay, so here's a famous example, and this is not something that I think I've never shared this before. So, but have you had Tom and I should know this, but have you had Tom and Max on?
Not yet. Oh. We'll say that. Not yet.
Definitely, they would be awesome. They're really great guys, and they have such incredible experience, and they have everything from the early Saturday Night Live when Bill Murray was in the cast. That was one of their first writing jobs out of college, to being the first writers on Late Night with David Letterman, to then writing for and producing The Simpsons and Seinfeld. I mean, they're really brilliant guys. So you should definitely get them to come on. They would be great. In any event, they were. I'll say something they might be a little shy about it. I don't know, but they're really good guys and they'd be great. Anyway, so Tom and his wife, Sandy Gillis, who was the producer of that daytime talk show I mentioned, I've known them, for, I don't know, like 40 years. Anyway, and I was always, really good friends with them. And they moved to LA. Oh, and they were writers on the early, the Gary Shandling Show. That's another incredible credit that Gamble and Pross have.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Tom and Sandy get married in LA. And I was just a building super in New York, working in those comedy clubs with Siobhan Fallon. And Tom and Sandy were like, oh, well, you can stay in our house. We'll fly you out here. So I stayed in their house then when they were getting married, and I was at the wedding. And then Tom knew that I was always really like into motorcycles and cars. He said, can you help me find a car? We need another car in LA. You got to have. And so I was like, I think it was maybe on that trip or another time I went out there. And so I helped them to find a car. And I knew Tom Gamble's style. Like he's really funny and he loves, quirky stuff. And so I found this car, which was this Chrysler LeBaron. And it had like this fake wood paneling on the side of the car. And I found it at this dealership, and I was looking at him like, I think Tom would really like this car. And he was paying me to find him a car. And the salesman at the place where this was on the lot was like, yeah, well, this car belonged to John Voight. And I was like, really? And he said, oh yeah, this is John Voight's mother's car. It was some bullshit line the guy was telling me. And I was this like impressionable actor. I'm like, oh, really? So I go back and I tell Tom about it. And he's like, it sounds good to me. And it's like, yeah, it's a Chrysler LeBaron convertible. It's great for LA. And so Tom was like, okay, let's buy it. So we bought the car. And that was Tom Gamble's car that he was driving around for years. And then years later, I wasn't even an NBC executive. I was still living in New York. Tom and Max are writing for Seinfeld. And I think they must have pitched out to Larry David, like, oh yeah, we once bought this car and the salesman told us it was John Voight's mother's, or, and that became that whole storyline in Seinfeld. You guys will know the episodes better than
the mom and pop story. Yeah.
And they used
driving around and used John Voight. Yeah.
And they got John Voight, and John Voight said it was total bullshit. No one in my family ever owned this car. But it was like they used Tom's actual LeBaron. That
89 LeBaron.
That car was the car that I got for Tom, and that George made famous. And so that's like a little story. I don't know if it means anything.
That's incredible.
That is amazing. Jeremiah, these stories are great. I think what made Seinfeld great was its unselfishness. And you could tell, you being on that show, you kind of, bleed unselfishness as well. All the credit you're giving to your predecessors and Rick and Brandon and Warren and Larry and Jerry. I mean, it shows, and you could tell that seeped on set. it seeped across the whole show, and that's why the show was great. So we can't thank you enough for.
Oh my God!
Thank you so much.
Taking a trip down memory lane with us.
Oh my God, guys! I'm sorry that it took so long for us to finally get together. I really I appreciate your patience and you even wanting. It's an honor for me for what you've built to be included with. For you, you clearly have such passion for the subject matter and care about it, and that you would include me in it. I just wanted to say a couple of other little things that relate to your show. I don't know. Are we out of time?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, we're
so
fine.
one other thing I wanted to say, because we talked about Siobhan, another person you interviewed who we kind of touched on was Tim Stack.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
So
of course. Son of the
Tim
Beach.
Stack,
Big Yankee
Tim
fan.
Stack was
Loved him.
is a writing partner with Jim Stein and Dave Morgeson. The three of them together created Son of the Beach, which later, much later in my career, when I was an executive at FX, I developed that show, and Tim is, awesome. And
Howard, the whole thing.
It's just so funny that there was that connection. And then the only other thing I was going to mention, just to make a shameless self promotion, was back in the mid '90s, I made this movie, this independent feature film, which basically it's the most self-indulgent idea possible, because it was basically my story of going from this rags to riches to rags story of building superintendent to network executive success, and then ultimately going back to quote unquote pursue the dream. And I made this movie. I financed it myself. It never got distribution, but the cast of Seinfeld, Jerry, Julia, Jason, Michael, George Shapiro, and Howard West, they're all in it in little cameo appearances and stuff. And I didn't know, I just thought, and I know this again is very self-indulgent, but I know your audience loves Seinfeld. I have a trailer that's like a minute long or maybe 80, 90 seconds long. I don't know if we can, on Zoom, if I can do a share screen, but if you're curious, and if we don't have time for it, then forget about it. But if you
we
wanted
could definitely do it.
I could, and you'd only might find it interesting just because you'll see very briefly everybody from Seinfeld in it.
Yeah.
What was the name of this, Jeremiah?
Yeah, what was the name?
The name of the movie?
Yeah.
So it's had two different incarnations. It initially was called Good Money, and then the current version is called Show Me Your Potatoes.
Have you ever made a choice or a decision and then later you say to yourself, why the hell did I do that?
So how's your career going, J-Man?
Things with me are going G-R-E-A-T. My career has taken off in a wonderful, if a bit unexpected, new direction. I don't know what I've done to mislead you, but I am not a prostitute.
I mean, is there anything you can personally do?
No, there's nothing I can personally do, but... Well, the next thing I know, I'm working at NBC. I couldn't believe it. I was working with people who were becoming household names.
I like my face. It helps me smile.
I don't like your face. I don't like your face at all.
No.
I know the ratings haven't been that great.
Well, that depends on how you look at the ratings.
I think I really got something for you this time.
Hey, fantastic.
No cast at all. I just wanted to be me. Yeah, that's what I'm kind of looking for. You don't see me.
The California raisins get an apartment in London.
I'm being a baby?
Okay, please,
Yeah,
guys.
you're being a baby.
The problem was,
Are you the one with the problem?
I'd always wanted to be an actor and a writer.
I very much like you, and I would like to spend some quality time with you.
One more.
Well, I had to talk to somebody about all this.
What are you thinking?
Jesus, you guys, come on.
But who?
So that's the great trailer.
All right. Yeah. That was awesome.
Siobhan Fallon plays herself. She's in the movie.
That was incredible.
That's awesome.
There was so many cameos. I mean, that was
Yeah, well, so there was George Shapiro and Howard West.
Yeah, they were both in there
with the comedian Wayne Cotter, who was a client of theirs. Tom Noonan was in that. Brandon Tartikoff, you noticed. The way I always thought about it was even if you hated my writing and my acting and just the combination of all these people, and Dick Cavett in his underwear getting spanked. I mean,
Conan,
Cavett is
early
awesome.
Conan.
Conan O'Brien and Andy Richter. I mean,
did you know Conan? Did you know Conan from the SNL tryout? Or
no, I knew Conan. I didn't know. I don't know Conan well, but when I was an executive at Fox, Conan was just coming off of Saturday Night Live with his then writing partner, Greg Daniels. Does that name mean anything?
Yeah, Greg Daniels is huge. I mean, Greg Daniels
is one of the biggest. The Office,
King of the Hill. I think he's involved in King of the Hill. Yeah,
I remember calling Conan directly because I didn't even know who his agent was or anything. Just saying, "Hey, I'm Jeremiah Bosgang. I work at Fox. I'd love to develop something with you." And then we bumped into each other on the Fox lot. He was a writer for The Simpsons. Writer-producer.
Yeah.
So he kind of knew who I was, and he knew I had worked at NBC. But the scene that he's in that movie, he and Andy weren't supposed to do it. It was supposed to be, I had just gotten permission to film this little scene in NBC on the set of Late Night, which Conan was host. He was host of Late Night at that time. So the scene was supposed to be this really low-level kiddie show that I was a writer for, this shitty kiddie show where the host would get in fights, which was loosely based on my first writing job into television, where I was writing for this kids show that was, and one of the two actors, the guys I lined up were these two Spanish-speaking guys, not actors, who worked in my building where I lived in the city at the time. They were guys who were just my friends. And I thought it would be funny if it was like two guys and they would break into a fight yelling at each other in Spanish. One of the guys never shows up at NBC. I'm like, what the fuck am I going to do? I can't do the scene. And there's Conan and Andy in their dressing rooms. They had just wrapped a taping. And so I just went up to him, and Conan was like, hey, like, I don't think he even remembered my name. But he's like, hey, man, hey, how you doing? I'm like, good. And I just quickly pitched it to them. I said, guys, I'm shooting this independent film. It's this little scene. It's with these two kiddie show performers. They get in a fight. Any chance that you two guys would do it? And Conan just looked at Andy, and Andy looked at Conan and said, what the hell? Yeah, sure, we'll do it. So I give them the outfits that I rented, those clown outfits. We go on their stage. We just run it once. We just do it, and we film it on 16 millimeter film. Boom, that was it. And then Conan and Andy are, and it was so cool that they did that favor for me. That's the type of guy Conan O'Brien and Andy Richter were. Like, they didn't know really me very well. And
I know Conan was tight with Rick. So I mean, it goes to show you.
You know, I don't know if he knew about that connection that I had at the time. I don't know if he put that together or not. But yes, Conan really did like Rick a lot, and he really respected him, as did Rick respect Conan.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry to shoehorn that in at the end and try to take
and that's like that's never before. I mean, that's not, you don't have that public anywhere, huh? You don't.
No, I don't. I mean, I was in some like
so much talent on that piece. It's so, it's so well done.
I know. It was always so disappointing to me, because now bear in mind, back when I made that movie, it was a theatrical distribution was the only thing you could hope for as an indie filmmaker. Now there's Netflix and Amazon.
Right.
Hulu.
Do you own it? Do you own the movie?
I do. I own it. I have signed releases.
So you can put it out anywhere right now. You can put it on YouTube.
I mean, when you look at, I could try that. But when you look at some of the stuff on these services, it's not like everything is, gold. I mean, a piece of crap like my movie would fit in perfectly on, Amazon or Netflix. So if there are any Amazon or Netflix or Hulu acquisitions executives who are watching your podcast, maybe they'll see this and they'll reach out.
And in the meantime, if you're in Jersey, I got a projector. We'll go out in the backyard. We'll have some fun and watch
it. You just let me know when you want me to be there.
Awesome. Well, Jeremiah, like I said, man, this has been great.
Incredible.
Well, thank you guys. You guys are
can't thank you enough.
Really fun. And thank you for having me. And thanks for letting me enjoy even further in my life the halo effect of a connection to the greatest show, one of the greatest shows in television history. So,
for sure.
Thanks
you so again, much, and we'll be in touch for sure.
I look forward to it. Thanks, guys. Stay safe.